Last month, with the launch of an encyclopedia called Latinos and Criminal Justice, researchers and policymakers received the first comprehensive account of the interrelationship between Hispanic Americans and criminal justice. It couldn't be more timely. Not only does the encyclopedia correct some common misperceptions in the media and on the campaign trail, but it sets out the data and analysis that should lead to smart policymaking. We're delighted to have the editor of that encyclopedia with us today on Criminal Justice Matters. Jose Luis Morin is chair of the Hispanic Studies Department at John Jay College. Joining him is Juan Cartagena, President and General Counsel of LatinoJustice PRL-DEF, one of the country's foremost organizations advocating for the Latino community in the U.S. Great to have you on the program.
Good to be here.
Jose Luis, let's start with you. This is an amazing book, heavy. Why do we need one? There isn't an encyclopedia of African Americans in criminal justice, Asians in criminal justice. Why Latinos in criminal justice?
Well, actually, there is one on African Americans, and I think that the reality is that there's been a gap in information about Latinos in criminal justice, and that was the impetus for this book. And one of the things that's unique about this book is that it's not simply an A through Z traditional encyclopedia format. The first part are longer essays on some critical issues such as drugs, gangs, Latinas, immigration, but it allows the reader to contextualize in historical, political, social context these important issues. And then the second part of the book is more traditional A through Z. They can cross-reference topics and issues from the first part and the second part. But the idea here is to drive home the point that there's much for us to know about the situation of Latinos and criminal justice in the United States. Much of it is being ignored. And it's called an encyclopedia, not the encyclopedia, because there's more information that we need to continue to gather, more data that we need to fill. But what we do know is that Latinos are oftentimes stereotyped. There are misconceptions about Latinos in criminal justice that are completely false. And this book goes a long way in trying to set the record straight.
Does it carve out, in effect, what is a distinctive relationship that Latinos have with the criminal justice system? After all, when we talk about Latinos, we're talking not just about one group, we're talking about a number of groups of different national origins, which makes it a little bit more complicated than, say, talking about African Americans.
That's correct. I mean, Latinos come from different countries in Latin America. They're not necessarily homogeneous.
But when they get here, the experience is the same?
Although there are trends and patterns of similarity, and particularly with regard to the criminal justice system and how Latinos are racialized, that is, looked at and treated as racially other by the criminal justice system, and therefore then we start seeing patterns of disparity between how whites are treated in the criminal justice system and how Latinos are treated in the criminal justice system.
Do we see patterns geographically as well? I mean, we know that for a long time, the bulk of the Latino populations were either in New York or the West Coast or the Southwest. So, and Juan, you live in New Jersey. Of course, you know you're representing a national organization. I mean, are there geographical issues as well that should be kept in mind when we talk about Latinos?
Oh,
and
definitely.
Criminal justice.
Definitely, because historical patterns of how the state has either sponsored or permitted violence, or looked the other way when police committed violence against Latino communities, and particularly in the border states for a long time. The historical antecedents, which this encyclopedia also bears out, about how over decades and centuries, people were vilified and also even subject to lynchings in the Southwest and Texas in many, many numbers. Not nearly as large as African Americans were lynched, but definitely the lynching of Mexicanos was clearly part and parcel of how individual populations were treated. So when you talk about Latinos, not only are they diverse in terms of national origin groups, they're diverse by race, and what unites us basically is a language, but even when you dig further than that, understanding the language of an Uruguayan to the language of a Dominican or Puerto Rican is no easy task.
So has one of the difficulties been in getting a Latino Lives Matter movement up and running, the fact that there are so many different types of experiences that Latinos have with the justice system? Is that
Yeah, and there are many
part of the problem.
factors that contribute to why it's been much more difficult for that kind of organization to be formed in Latino communities. One of the questions, obviously, is what is the situation of status in terms of whether the undocumented community within the Latino community and the hesitancy sometimes for the Latino community, because there are a number of people who are undocumented, to engage in law enforcement because they don't want to have to disclose that there are family members or some people in their community who are undocumented.
That adds a whole other dimension, obviously, to that.
And we don't have, in some of the institutions, as in the African American community, like the churches, which have been traditionally at the forefront of civil rights in African American communities, the trajectory for churches in some of the institutions in the Latino communities have not followed that same strain. So that is another reason why some of these organizational matters don't just come up in the Latino community as they have in African American communities around criminal justice.
So, but I guess one of the issues that, or the questions that in my mind is how do you formulate a policy? I mean, where does the information, the data, the amazing data that you've compiled lead to a coherent policy? It's one thing, we talk about the African American experience with the justice system, with cops, with courts, with prisons. There seems to be a very clear line, which begins with the over-racialization of the system. With Latinos, there's a lot of different ambiguous lines, and it's hard to sort of to chart a policy, especially as we're coming now into an election period, and you want legislators at the local and national level to do something about it, but it's hard to say what should they do.
Right. So one of the other factors that I did mention about how difficult it's been to organize around these issues in the Latino community is that the media itself has not been reporting this. And the media has, and some have actually posited this idea that oftentimes the media will look at what the issue that is of concern to Latinos is solely immigration. When it comes to criminal justice matters and other kinds of things, they'll look at the African American community as being their issue, but not necessarily criminal justice. And this book is an attempt to also educate the media that has been negligent in many ways and not being able to look at how the Latino community is disproportionately affected and negatively affected by the criminal justice system.
And that is so important because right now we're weeks away from an election, right, in which one of the major candidates has made a big stink and a big appeal to his base that says basically the Mexicans are rapists and Mexicans are all criminals. Right. That whole entire notion is not just an outrageous insult, but it's belied by all the facts. And one of the things in this book is that it's very, very clear about criminal behavior or propensity for criminal behavior. It's much, much less in immigrant communities, regardless of where they're from, including Mexicans, than it is among native born of all races and nationalities.
So you just had a marvelous conference at John Jay and at a few other venues on trying to sensitize people to the issues of Latinos and justice. And obviously a central part of that was waking up the media to the problem. Right. But that's only a start. So what is it that the media isn't doing correctly? I mean, we're reporting the news. We're certainly concentrating now on the flaws in the justice system. What isn't the media doing in terms of Latinos and criminal
So
justice?
often what we have is the media reporting that the Latino community is offended by what is being stated by one of the major candidates for presidency right now.
By
but
Donald Trump.
but oftentimes what they fail to do is just to say very clearly and present the facts about how what he's saying is actually false. And that's one of the things that we've been attempting to bring to the forefront with this book, with the conference, that it's time that the media pay attention to the facts, and facts do matter. And because facts have not been really coming out about the reality and the truth about how Latinos are affected by the criminal justice system, Latino communities are being negatively affected and harmed by this information continuing to be perpetuated around the country, that Latinos pose a criminal threat to the population.
But the sense of solidarity among Latinos in terms of the treatment that Latinos receive at the criminal justice system is in a way a little bit new, because from my experience reporting and people I know, many Latinos or Hispanic Americans resist being lumped into one big ethnic group with problems that are the same, and they've resisted that. There are as many different political strands of opinion among Hispanic Americans as there are among all Americans.
Sure.
So has that been a problem, or is there something that's changed in the sensitivity or the radar of Hispanic
I think it's
Americans?
changed over time, and that's because of the generational, of our generational presence here in the United States over time. I mean, think about New York stop and frisk tactics here by the New York City Police Department. They were as equally targeted to long-standing Puerto Rican Dominican populations, many of whom are already citizens of the United States, as they were to African Americans.
On the basis that they were black, or
On the
that
basis
they
that
just
were-
looked Latino?
On the basis that was group suspicion. The entire premise of stop and frisk in New York City was you are a member of a group that looks suspicious, so therefore I should stop every one of you and prevent crime before it happens. That was completely debunked by the federal judge in her opinion. The Constitution does not permit group-based suspicion. It has to be individualized suspicion. That never stopped the police from targeting long-standing citizens, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and others in New York City. So your point is true about how there has been resistance to lump, because there's a lot of national pride in all of our populations, of course. But over time, we have recognized, at least when it comes to the criminal justice system, that it really makes little difference if you're a Dominican, Ecuadorian, or Mexican. You're being profiled in virtually the same way, whether you're a citizen or non-citizen. Even if you're a non-citizen, whether you have permanent residence or you have undocumented status, it really doesn't make a difference. There are some other issues that are very unique, though. I would say quickly. Profiling. Profiling happens in major ways across the border, both the northern border with Canada and definitely throughout the southern border, in ways that affect populations of Latinos very, very uniquely. 2, detention centers and the privatization of prisons. The bulk of people who are in these detention centers, who are in the deportation queue, especially in the Obama administration, are mostly Mexicans and Central Americans. How privatized detentions work and harm those prisoners is a unique Latino issue as well. You can also see bail setting. There have been some studies that talk about that bail is set at enormously high rates, even in some cases higher than African Americans, for Latinos versus whites or blacks. Why? Because the perception, misconception is that if it's a drug case, then that Latino must be involved in some cartel. And bam, there goes denial of bail. So we see unique issues that affect Latino populations that have to be elevated before they can be resolved.
So Jose Luis, give us some of the main highlights, the takeaways that we should take from the book that you found over the course of your investigation.
So among the things that is critically important is that oftentimes Latinos are pegged as high users of drugs in the United States. In fact, the data is shown not only just recently, but over time that Latinos are taking illicit substances at much lower levels than whites. And that's consistent over time, including drugs where Latinos have been stereotyped, like cocaine and marijuana. Those are drugs that compared to whites, Latinos are not shown in the data as using at the same percentage as whites. However, in the criminal justice system, Latinos are going to be much more tending to be prosecuted and arrested much more frequently for those same drug offenses.
2 other areas that I wonder if you can just give us some quick bullet points on. One is the question of officer-involved shootings. There have been some very high-profile cases in the last couple of months about Latinos or Hispanics who've been shot by police, and also issues of the prison and correction system, which most of what we know about Latinos in the criminal justice system, the correction system, is to do with gangs, particularly in California and the Southwest. What aren't we seeing in both of those 2 areas?
So within the area of shootings, police shootings in Latino communities, the pattern has been very similar to African American communities, except the media has not necessarily been covering many of those instances. Again, that's one of those examples where the media is looking at the Latino community as solely through the lens of immigration. Whereas in the correction system, Latinos, particularly in places like Rikers Island, have also been affected negatively by the kinds of behaviors by corrections officers in the prison system, in jails throughout the United States. And California is a perfect example how Latino prisoners in the correction system in California that's been the subject of federal case, and California has been forced to reduce its prison population because of the overcrowding and conditions that people have been held in the prison system in California.
One of the things that strikes me most about your book is the fact that you've compiled an amazing amount of data, as I said earlier, and there's still a lot more to be compiled, obviously. But there hasn't been this kind of data up till now, and that seems to be a striking flaw in the system. You're a judge in the system. Why haven't we known about the extent? It was just not cared, or has it just been a question of we've just been insufficiently or flawed in compiling them?
Oh, well, there's definitely flaws in compiling the data. There's a lot of states, at our count, there's about 11 states that still report out data on arrests and people in the prison system, state prison systems, in a black and white binary.
So we don't know. Still.
Thank you. And can you imagine that? It's 2016. Can you imagine a state saying we don't know how many Latinos there are in our prison system because we don't know how to count them? That's outrageously bad.
Well, do people self-identify, or is it?
Well, they are self-identified throughout New York and California, having some of the best data reporting systems in the entire country are self-identified. So there has to be better ways to collect the data. So there's definitely that. Two, there's this notion that this has been going on for a long time, but no one really pays attention to it. It hasn't really elevated to the national discourse at the same level it has with the African American community, for the reasons that Jose already alluded to. The fact of the matter is that we are at a point now. Criminal justice is on the lips of virtually every major candidate for public office today. You would not have had that conversation 10 years ago. We are now at the forefront of potential reform, potential sentencing reform, reduction of populations in states because they recognize how expensive it is to continue to house people in cells as opposed to help them recover and reentry. And all this momentum is at a point now that we have to recognize and take advantage. The problems, though, have to be solved with the best information possible and recognizing how it impacts subsets of our populations in ways different than the entire population.
That's a very good point, but the other side of that is if, depending on the outcome of the election, we may be going backwards rather than forward.
Well, then that means that we have to dig in harder and make sure we get the things done. I mean, we're not going to go away. He or she is only around for 8 years at best.
Where do you see most of the efforts that need to be made at the local or the national level? What has to be the start, really?
I think there's gonna have to work. There has to be work on both fronts, because undoubtedly, what happens at the national level is going to affect nationwide, and on the local level, communities have to be much more organized. And thank goodness we have organizations like LatinoJustice that work on both levels and are advocates for many Latino communities who would otherwise not have a voice. And that's one of the ways in which I think we are coupling both the information, the academics who are working in it. I'm not the only one working in this area. That's the other important point of this. But there are also Latino organizations that are deeply concerned with this issue and engaging in it locally and nationally. And LatinoJustice is one of those organizations.
Just in the time we have left, we only have a little short amount of time left, but it brings me back to a larger issue, which is what kinds of inroads are you making or efforts are you making to begin any solidarity with African Americans or other ethnic groups that are doing the same thing? Or is it counterproductive to have that kind of solidarity because then it blurs the issue?
I don't think it's counterproductive at all. Reforming the criminal justice system must have uppermost and clearly in the forefront public safety. And dealing with public safety while also addressing criminal justice reform is not an easy task. We can only do so in solidarity if all the other groups have recognized that there's some problems with policing and there's some problems with the criminal justice system writ large, and there's a problem in the country with over-incarceration. That kind of change can only happen if we actually work in tandem with many groups who see that way and are trying to make sure that public safety is not compromised while we do reform. And that is extremely important. I go back to our stop and frisk encounters. The ability of New York City's entire community of all races who are concerned about the policing tactics of that episode in our history, our recent history, was significant. We curbed stop and frisk dramatically, and public safety was not compromised. That only happened in solidarity.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there for the moment, but thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
The Encyclopedia of Latinos in Criminal Justice puts in one place the facts and the tragedies of the Latino experience with our criminal justice system. That may not change the minds of those who rely on stereotypes, fear, and prejudice to advance their political agendas. But for the rest of us, there's no longer any excuse for closing our eyes or our minds I'm Steve Handelman. Thanks for watching. See you next time.